On the 8th of June 793, raiders attacked the monastery of Lindisfarne, a sacred community on a tidal island off the coast of Northumbria. The surviving accounts leave the size and appearance of the raiding force unknown. They also preserve no eyewitness testimony from an individual monk. What they do record is clear enough. The church was plundered, members of the community were killed, and captives may have been taken. Alcuin of York learned of the attack while living at the court of Charlemagne. In a letter written soon afterward, he described the sanctuary of St. Cuthbert as stripped of its treasures and stained with the blood of priests. The attack was not the first recorded encounter between Scandinavian seafarers and the English. A few years earlier, men arriving in 3 ships had killed a royal official on the southern coast. Lindisfarne mattered for a different reason. It was one of the spiritual centres of Northumbria, associated with St. Cuthbert and respected far beyond the island. Violence at such a place made the new danger impossible to dismiss. Later generations treated the raid as the beginning of the Viking Age in England. The date is useful, although the transformation did not begin in a single morning. Scandinavian sailors had crossed the North Sea before 793, and commercial networks already connected ports around the Baltic, the North Atlantic, and the British Isles. What changed near the end of the 8th century was the increasing use of those maritime routes for organized violence. The people involved did not belong to one Viking nation. They came from communities in the regions now called Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Their related languages and runic writing belonged to societies supported by agriculture, trade, craft production, and service to local rulers. The Vikings themselves wrote short inscriptions in runes, even though most detailed written descriptions of their expeditions came from the Christian societies they attacked. The word Viking described an activity more readily than a permanent ethnic identity. Someone who traded during one voyage could join a raid during another. Loyalty might be given to a household leader, a regional chieftain, or a king whose power depended on rewarding followers. It is misleading to explain Scandinavian expansion with one simple story about poor farmers or younger sons who received no inheritance. Land pressure may have influenced particular individuals, but the wider movement had several causes. Scandinavian trading networks were expanding. Rival rulers needed wealth to maintain military support. Successful commanders attracted men by distributing silver and other valuables. Profit from one voyage could finance another, gradually turning small expeditions into larger enterprises. Shipbuilding made those ventures possible. Scandinavian vessels varied greatly in their design and capacity. Some were built for cargo, while others were intended for speed. Many combined the ability to cross open water with a shallow draft that allowed them to approach beaches and enter rivers. This did not mean that a longship could travel anywhere. Weather, tides, navigation, and access to supplies still limited every expedition. The advantage came from flexibility. A fleet could move from the sea into an inland waterway without depending on a major harbour. English rulers had traditionally defended territory through roads, fortified centres, and locally raised armies. Viking fleets introduced a moving front that might appear far from the coast before defenders understood where the main attack was developing. For several decades after Lindisfarne, many attacks followed a seasonal pattern. Ships arrived during favourable weather and targeted places where portable wealth could be taken quickly. Monasteries were attractive because they possessed precious metal and were not designed as military fortresses. Ports and trading settlements offered goods that could be carried away or exchanged elsewhere. Human beings were also taken. Captives could be sold through slave markets connected to Scandinavia, the Baltic, and regions farther east. The English kingdoms could raise armies, but those forces were not permanently stationed along every river and section of coastline. News of an attack first had to travel inland. Local officials then summoned men who had farms and other obligations of their own. By the time an army assembled, the raiders might already have left. This strategic advantage did not make Viking forces invincible. English kings defeated Scandinavian armies on several occasions. The difficulty was that the defenders had to protect many possible targets, while an attacking fleet could decide where to concentrate. The scale of the danger increased after the 830s, when larger fleets began confronting royal armies. By the middle of the 9th century, some Scandinavian forces were remaining in England through the winter. Overwintering altered the conflict. A force that stayed could repair its ships, obtain food, negotiate with nearby rulers, and begin a new campaign before the expected sailing season. Temporary camps became military bases from which surrounding territory could be controlled. Raiding was beginning to merge with conquest and settlement. In 865, the force remembered as the Great Army arrived in East Anglia. Its exact size is unknown. Medieval writers used imprecise terms for large military groups, and later estimates often depend on speculation. Archaeological work at sites including Torksey and Repton nevertheless confirms that these were substantial mobile communities. The army contained more than battlefield troops. Craftspeople, merchants, and other followers moved with it or gathered around its camps. Equipment had to be repaired, food acquired, and captured metal divided or exchanged. The Great Army was not governed by one permanent command structure. Different leaders controlled different groups, and sections of the force sometimes separated to pursue their own objectives. Cooperation continued while it remained useful. This flexibility allowed the army to survive setbacks. A defeat in one region did not necessarily destroy the entire enterprise. The force could divide, demand payment, settle temporarily, or gather again for another campaign. The rulers of East Anglia supplied the newcomers with horses and made peace with them. The arrangement allowed the army to move rapidly over land without transporting a large number of animals across the North Sea. The following year, the army travelled north. Northumbria was already weakened by a struggle between rival kings. The Vikings entered York in 866. The Northumbrian claimants eventually united against the invaders, but both were killed during the attempt to recover the city in 867. Scandinavian leaders now controlled the kingdom's main political and commercial centre. East Anglia was defeated soon afterward. Its king, Edmund, was killed in 869 or 870. Later religious traditions described his torture and execution in detail, but those accounts were written after the event. The precise circumstances of his death cannot be established with certainty. Mercia survived longer because its rulers alternated between resistance and negotiation. In 873 and 874, the Great Army occupied Repton. King Burgred was driven into exile, and a ruler willing to cooperate with the invaders replaced him. The political geography of England had been overturned. Northumbria had lost its independence. East Anglia had fallen, while most of Mercia was no longer capable of resisting. Only Wessex remained outside Scandinavian control. Alfred became King of Wessex in 871 after the death of his brother Thofrid. He was young, but he was not an inexperienced scholar suddenly placed in charge of an army. Alfred had already taken part in the fighting of 871, including the West Saxon victory at Ashdown. By the time he inherited the throne, he understood both the strengths of the Viking armies and the weaknesses of the West Saxon military system. His first years as king brought further battles, followed by periods of negotiated peace. Wessex paid for time when continued resistance was impractical. Scandinavian forces then shifted their attention toward other regions. The settlement did not last. In early 878, Guthrum's army attacked Alfred's royal centre at Chippenham. The timing caught the West Saxons unprepared. Local resistance collapsed, and Alfred withdrew with a small following into the marshes of Somerset. He established a fortified base at Athelney. The familiar story of Alfred burning cakes in a peasant woman's house was written centuries later. It cannot be used as reliable evidence for what happened during those weeks. What can be established is that Alfred remained politically active. He maintained contact with loyal supporters and prepared to restore his army. In May, men from Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire answered his summons. Alfred met Guthrum's army at Edington and won a decisive victory. The defeated force withdrew to a fortified position. After a siege lasting about 2 weeks, Guthrum sought terms. The Viking leader accepted baptism. with Alfred acting as his sponsor. Guthrum later ruled East Anglia as a Christian king. Edington saved Wessex, but it did not drive Scandinavian rulers out of northern and eastern England. The political division that followed developed gradually. A treaty associated with Alfred and Guthrum, generally dated to around 886, marked a boundary between their areas of authority. Much of the north and east belonged to the region later known as the Danelaw. Alfred used the respite to reorganize his kingdom. Fortified towns, known as burhs, gave local populations somewhere to shelter and provided protected bases for troops. Military service was arranged so that part of the available force could remain active while other men returned to their farms. The burhs also became centers of markets and royal administration. Effective defense now depended on taxation, maintained roads, reliable coinage, and the authority to organize labor. Alfred promoted education and the translation of important works into written English. He issued laws and strengthened communication between the crown and local government. His achievement cannot be reduced to a single victory at Edington. Wessex survived because Alfred made the kingdom more difficult to surprise and more capable of continuing a long war. Life in the Danelaw was more complicated than a permanent struggle between two separate peoples. Scandinavian commanders took land and exercised political authority, but settlers lived among existing English communities. Some of those who arrived as warriors eventually became farmers. Others worked in towns or participated in trade. York developed as an important centre of manufacturing and exchange. Objects found there and at other settlements reveal connections across Scandinavia, the Irish Sea, and continental Europe. Written chronicles tell this period mainly through kings and battles. Archaeology reveals a different layer of experience. Excavated streets and workshops preserve evidence of textile production, metalworking, food preparation, house construction, and the repair of everyday objects. These discoveries do not show that conquest was peaceful. They show that settlement eventually required people to develop ordinary routines within a changed political order. The newcomers did not maintain a completely separate Scandinavian society. Conversion to Christianity proceeded at different speeds. Marriage and local alliances gradually changed the identities of both settlers and established communities. English and Old Norse were related Germanic languages. Contact between their speakers influenced vocabulary and left a strong mark on the names of settlements. Place names ending in forms such as asterisk, bi remain especially common in regions once governed under Scandinavian authority. Local government also developed distinctive terminology. In parts of the Danelaw, districts known as wapentakes performed functions similar to the hundreds found elsewhere in England. The influence of Scandinavian settlement survived every later change of king. It affected landholding, commerce, local law, and language. The north and east retained connections with the wider Norse world even as they became part of an English kingdom. The Danelaw therefore changed England long after its political boundaries disappeared. Alfred died in 899. His son Edward the Elder inherited Wessex and continued the struggle for territory held by Scandinavian rulers. Edward worked closely with his sister Thunthulflide. She had married Thutir the Red, the ruler of Mercia, as part of the alliance between Mercia and Wessex. When her husband died, Thunthulflide governed as the Lady of the Mercians. She strengthened fortified settlements and directed campaigns against Scandinavian-held territory. Edward advanced from the south, while Mercian forces applied pressure from the west. Their progress was gradual. Strategic towns submitted, fortresses changed hands, and local leaders negotiated with the expanding West Saxon monarchy. This was not a simple removal of everyone with Scandinavian ancestry. Communities that had developed under Viking rule often remained in place. Political control changed while much of the population stayed on the same land. Edward died in 924. His son Sinthelstan later took control of York in 927 and became the first ruler to govern all the principal territories that formed England. The achievement remained vulnerable. York returned to Scandinavian rulers after Thiristander's death. Control of the north changed several times before the last independent Viking king of York, was removed in 954. English unity therefore had to be recreated through military success, negotiation and administration. A royal title alone could not guarantee obedience in distant regions. Even so, a permanent transformation had taken place. Before the Great Army, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex had been independent kingdoms with competing interests. The Viking invasions destroyed that balance. Wessex survived by developing institutions capable of mobilizing resources across a larger area. Alfred's successors then extended those institutions over territories that had once belonged to rivals. The Viking challenge did not invent the idea of an English people. Earlier writers, including Bede, had already described the English in collective terms. The wars did help turn that idea into a durable political kingdom. Scandinavian power in York ended during the 10th century, but contact across the North Sea continued. Large-scale raiding resumed during the 980s in the reign of Tundi Thuddard, later known as the Unready. The name came from a term meaning poorly advised rather than physically unprepared. These later expeditions differed from many of the early raids. Powerful Scandinavian rulers could now support larger fleets, and England had become a wealthy, comparatively centralized kingdom. That made England harder to conquer quickly. It also made the country more profitable to threaten. After an English defeat at Maldon in 991, Thelred's government paid a substantial tribute to encourage the attackers to leave. Payment could be a rational response when the king needed time or lacked a reliable army. The weakness appeared over repeated campaigns. Silver ended an immediate attack while showing future commanders that England possessed the resources to pay again. In 1002, Thelred ordered the killing of Danes in England on St. Brice's Day. The extent of the order remains uncertain. It is unlikely that every Scandinavian settler across the former Danelaw could have been attacked. Evidence points, instead, to episodes of violence in particular places, including Oxford. The order reveals how political fear had become connected to ethnic suspicion. Later writers claimed that one of the victims was a sister of the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard. That account is not securely supported by contemporary evidence. Sweyn's campaigns intensified after 1002, but revenge cannot be assumed to have been his only motive. England's wealth offered a powerful incentive. Sweyn also sought royal authority, while Twelvetred struggled to maintain the loyalty of important English nobles. In 1013, organized resistance collapsed. Sweyn was accepted as king, and Feli Thelred fled to Normandy. Sweyn died only weeks later. Thelred returned, but the contest for England continued. Sweyn's son Sienut resumed the invasion. He fought Thelred, son Edmund Ironside, for control of the kingdom. In 1016, the two rulers agreed to divide England after a series of campaigns. Edmund died later that year, leaving Nut as king of the entire country. Nut's reign shows why the Viking period cannot be understood as a permanent division between foreign invaders and English victims. He ruled through the machinery of the English kingdom. English law and administrative practice remained in use. Nut relied on English nobles, as well as Scandinavian followers. Although he acted ruthlessly while securing his position, his marriage to Emma of Normandy, the widow of Tinti Thelred, connected the new regime to the previous royal family. It also helped strengthen Sienut's position within English and European politics. Nut later became king of Denmark and Norway, placing England within a wider northern empire. He benefited from institutions developed by the West Saxon rulers. England could levy taxes, produce reliable coinage, and communicate royal commands through shires and local officials. A Scandinavian conqueror inherited this system instead of dismantling it. His ability to rule England demonstrates how far the kingdom had developed during the long wars against earlier Viking armies. When Nut died in 1035, his empire did not remain united. His sons ruled England for short periods, and the West Saxon dynasty returned in 1042 under Edward the Confessor. The Scandinavian era had not been erased. Families of mixed ancestry remained, commercial routes continued to operate, and memories of Danish rule formed part of English political life. Edward the Confessor died without a child in January 1066. Harold Godwinson was chosen as king, but his position was challenged from outside England. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, claimed the English throne. He invaded with the support of Harold's exiled brother, Tostig. The Norwegian army sailed into northern England and defeated regional English forces at Fulford. On the 20th of September, York submitted soon afterward. King Harold moved north with remarkable speed. He gathered troops along the route and reached the region of York before Hardrada expected him. On the 25th of September, the armies met at Stamford Bridge. The Norwegians appear to have been surprised, and some had left their armour near their ships. The battle was prolonged and costly, but the English eventually broke the invading force. Harold Hardrada was killed. Tostig also died after refusing to abandon the campaign. Contemporary tradition recorded that roughly 300 ships had carried the Norwegian army to England. After the battle, only about 24 were needed to transport the survivors home. The victory ended Hardrada's attempt to restore Scandinavian rule. It also left Harold's forces little time to recover. William, Duke of Normandy, landed in southern England on the 28th of September. Harold moved back toward London and then continued into Sussex. On the 14th of October, the English and Norman armies fought near Hastings. Harold was killed, his army was defeated, and William became king. Stamford Bridge is often used to mark the end of the Viking Age in England. The date is convenient, although Scandinavian people and cultural influences did not disappear. The Normans themselves descended from Scandinavian settlers who had adopted the French language and the political culture of northern France. The England they conquered had already been reshaped by centuries of contact with the Norse world. The Vikings changed Britain through destruction, but destruction was only the first stage. Their armies broke the older kingdoms and seized territory. Scandinavian settlement then joined newcomers with existing communities and redirected important networks of trade. English rulers responded to the military danger by creating stronger systems of defense and government. Those reforms eventually helped Wessex extend its authority across the regions that became England. By 1066, England was a unified and unusually centralized kingdom. Its administrative resources were among the reasons both Scandinavian and Norman rulers considered it worth conquering. The Viking legacy cannot be located in one battle or one royal family. It survives in the names of towns and villages across northern and eastern England. Old Norse influenced the English language, while Scandinavian legal and commercial customs became part of regional life. The political legacy was even larger. England's creation was accelerated by the crisis of invasion. Kingdoms that had once competed independently were absorbed into a larger system capable of raising armies, collecting revenue, maintaining fortifications, and governing extensive territory. The process involved violence and displacement. It also produced accommodation, conversion, and new communities whose descendants could no longer be divided neatly into Viking and English populations. The raid on Lindisfarne began as a shock recorded by frightened Christian writers. The age that followed ended with an England those monks would scarcely have recognized. It was politically united, closely connected to Northern Europe, and permanently marked by the people who had first arrived from across the sea.